Today, we have a great guest for you and a very interesting discussion. It's my pleasure to welcome Daniel Markovits. He's a professor of law at Yale Law School. He's the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law, and he's author of an interesting and somewhat counterintuitive book. Really opened my eyes to a new way of looking at this whole concept. The book is entitled The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and here's the counterintuitive part: devours the elite. Really interesting discussion. So I think you'll enjoy this, and let's go ahead and get into it. Dan, welcome. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's my pleasure. And you know what I found really interesting about your book? One of the points I recall you making, and now, you have to forgive me because this is several books ago now. I tend to go through them pretty quick, but is how how the rich, how the aristocrats used to brag about how little time they spent working, and how that has completely changed, and people brag about how busy they are. I remember you making a point similar to that. Am I correct?
Yes. So it used to be, if you wanted to know how poor somebody was, you just had to ask how hard they worked. And the harder you worked, the poorer you were. And
Right.
leisure, which is to say not working productively, was the sort of constitutive or central or core ideal of the aristocratic elite. They owned things, they owned land, they owned factories, and they got their money by mixing the things that they owned with other people's labor and then extracting surplus for themselves. Whereas today the elite is meritocratic. It works very hard. It works harder than it used to. It actually works harder than the rest of society in a certain way, and that labor is, that's the core of its self-conception and also the core of its economic structure.
hmm Yeah, that's really quite interesting. How and it just made me think of my last visit to Newport, Rhode Island, and thinking of all those super wealthy industrialists and all their leisure time and so forth. And yeah, I think we really have it wrong about a lot of things nowadays. It's sort of interesting. So whenever you want to share your screen, please go ahead and do that. And if you're just listening to this out there on audio, I'll try and describe what's on the screen for you as well, and I'm sure Dan will. And we'll go ahead and dive into this great presentation that he gives. So it's all yours. Go ahead and start.
So in a way, what this book is about, The Meritocracy Trap, is it's sort of a systematic attack on meritocracy. And it's hard to mount an attack like that because meritocracy is the common sense of our age. It just seems right that people should get ahead based on their own accomplishments rather than on their parents' social class, for example. But the idea of the book is that what meritocracy has done, in fact, rather than leveling the playing field, is create a new form of aristocracy. It's just now based on degrees rather than breeding. And it's a form of aristocracy that excludes the middle class from meaningful advantage in society, and at the same time ensnares the elite that seems to benefit in ways that require it to work in soulless and self-destructive ways, so that meritocracy doesn't benefit anybody. One way to get at
that is such an interesting thesis, and you must get a lot of flack over that. I would imagine a lot of people just don't believe it, and I didn't when I started in on the book, but you definitely moved the needle in my mind.
Well, I think there are two things that people want to resist about it. One thing people want to resist is they want to resist the idea that the inequality that we have now is caused by meritocracy. They want to focus instead on the ways in which elites commit fraud or cheat or game the system to get ahead. So think about something like the varsity blues admissions scandal in college, which is a scandal in which very wealthy parents were paying coaches, test-taking people to lie about their kids' qualifications to get the kids into college. So that's not meritocracy. That's a violation of meritocracy in which the rich are cheating to get ahead. And what the book argues is that, of course, happens. That's true. It's real. But it's a very small part of the advantage that elites have. Much bigger advantages come from the elites playing within the meritocratic rules, effectively by out investing in education, spending more on education than anybody else. And actually, if I just show you some slides that explain this. So one thing that's happened in the past 50 or 60 years is that rich and well-educated people have started marrying each other. So that the share of couples in which both partners have a college degree has grown by a factor of 8 since the middle of the last century. And it's not just that rich and educated people marry each other, it's that they stay married and they raise their children inside marriages. So that in 1960, a woman's education had very little impact on whether she had children inside marriage, whether she got divorced, whether she raised children inside marriage. Whereas today, women with a high school education or less bear more than 50% of their children outside of marriage. Whereas women with a college education or more bear only 3% of their children outside of marriage. So that marriage has become a rich and well-educated person's practice. And growing up with both parents present in a financially stable household obviously helps a child's schooling and helps their career prospects. The rich then also dramatically outspend everybody else on educating their children. So no part of consumption has grown as quickly, or consumption inequality has grown as quickly as consumption inequality on education. In 1972, the richest fifth of parents spent about $2,500 a year more on enrichment expenditures for their children, on tutors, on sports coaches, on arts classes, than the poorest fifth of parents. But by 2005, that gap had grown to $7,500 a year. The rich spend even more extremely on education. An average typical public school in America spends $12,000 to $15,000 per pupil per year on educating its children. But the Forbes 20 top private schools in America spend on average $75,000 per pupil per year. So that's 5 times as much educating kids
Wow.
as a typical public school. Those differences in investment produce huge differences in achievement. I'm showing a
question
right
for
now.
you. I'm surprised about something though. You started off by talking about how the rich marry the rich. I mean, I'm surprised to hear that that's changed. It would seem like that was true hundreds of years ago as it is today. In fact, I would think today there would be more inter-economic mating. How's that one for a term?
So, yes, good. So the word that economists actually use for this practice is assortative mating, which is an ugly word, but it captures the idea. And you're right that 100 years ago, the rich married the rich. Now, at the middle of the last century, that practice was at an all-time low. And there was much more marriage across economic stratification. And there's actually a simple reason for it and a less simple reason for it. The less simple reason is that as inequality grows, the rich get more isolated. So that, for example, if you look at what demographers call the neighborhood sorting index by income and education, that has roughly doubled in the past 50 or 60 years, which means that the odds that somebody who is rich has rich neighbors has gone way up. And insofar as you meet people in your neighborhood, that means that the rich are more likely to be socially enclosed and marry only each other. And that pattern has...
That's so interesting to me, because I would think that almost would be different today. Nowadays, people of all classes access everything. It seems like in the old days, you have the country club set, and you have, people going to the Kentucky Derby in Ascot, and they really were separated. But now lots of people do all of these things, right?
I think it turns out that's just not true. In a sense, you're right that in 1920, you had the country club set in that way. But between 1950 and 1975, we had a relatively economically integrated society. And since 1980 or so, we've become massively economically segregated. And you can think of it in a variety of ways. So, for example, in 1970, the average house sold in the mainline suburbs of Philadelphia was only about twice as expensive as the average house in America. In 1970, the average fancy restaurant meal was only about twice as much as an ordinary restaurant meal. Everybody shopped at Safeway. Whereas today, what economic inequality has done is it's created neighborhoods where houses are 10 times as expensive or 20 times as expensive as the average.
That is certainly true. And I think it's because there have been, huge portions of the economy of providers of everything under the sun that have catered to just ultra high end, whether it be super mega yachts, $65 million Gulfstream jets, it's mega expensive exclusive memberships to things. But that class of people has become larger than it was, say, during the industrial era, or, with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and such. But it's also,
it's not just
it's
that
hard
class.
To dice this stuff up.
It's not just that class. So, for example, in 1960, a cardiologist made about 4 times as much as a nurse. Today, a cardiologist makes 10 times as much as a nurse.
True of CEOs versus average workers, too, with the companies.
Right. CEOs
the CEO
versus
pay
average
is like
workers.
340 times
exactly,
the bottom rung.
As opposed to 20 or 30 times. And what happens is when you get enough people who are rich enough, you get exactly what you've described, which is an entire cultural and commercial ecosystem that caters to them. So, one thing I point out in the book, Taco Bell and the French Laundry, which is a fancy restaurant in California, don't have a single ingredient in common. Not even the salt. They get their salt from different places. That is to say, if you're the kind of person who goes to the French Laundry, you don't eat any ingredients that have the same origin or character as the kind of person who goes to a middle-class fast food restaurant. And our society
Taco Bell doesn't use Himalayan pink salt.
Yeah, actually, the French Laundry gets its salt from one of the last remaining live salt beds in the Pacific Ocean. But yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
Get the idea.
And that completely separates people. The other thing, by the way, to go back to assortative mating, that's a big deal and is complicated because everybody should applaud this development. But the admission of women into universities has meant that now women and men in the elite meet and marry in elite colleges and graduate schools. And so what you have is gender equality produces economic sorting. Because
that's
it used to be when Harvard was all male.
They didn't have the opportunity to meet
they weren't
college.
They weren't going to meet a college-educated woman in the same way because their college discriminated against women.
Who were the Harvard men meeting then? How did they meet their wives? When it was all male.
Right. So they were more likely to meet their wives through their childhood social networks, through the office, through things other than the university. And at a place like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, right now there are more kids whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution than the entire bottom 60%. So that if you meet your spouse at Harvard, it's overwhelmingly likely that you're going to meet your spouse of the same extremely elite social class as you are yourself. There are few less egalitarian, economically egalitarian matchmaking systems than elite American universities today.
And of course, you would think with all of the scholarships and the affirmative action style pressure, I'm not saying officially affirmative action, but the political correctness pressure and such, you would think that would be different nowadays. I'm surprised.
Well, if you look at the slide I'm showing now, What this
Right.
slide shows is the rich-poor achievement gap and the white-black achievement gap for different high school cohorts in America. And it shows that by 2000, the rich-poor gap had gotten bigger than the white-black gap was in 1954, which is the year Brown against Board of Education was decided. So that economic inequality produces a bigger gap in academic achievement in high school today than apartheid did at mid-century. And if you look at the relationship on the next slide between parents' income and SAT scores, a typical kid whose parents make more than $200,000 a year scores about 250 points higher than a middle-class kid does on the SAT, whereas the middle-class kid scores only about 125 points higher than a kid at or below the poverty level. So that the rich middle-class gap on SAT scores is twice as big as the middle-class poor gap. And that's what produces these enormous skews in who goes to college and who goes to elite colleges. Basically, what happens is the rich are training their kids to beat the tests. And then when you admit kids based on the test, you admit rich kids.
Okay, fair enough. So I think we have to back up and look at a big picture step for a moment, because there's a lot of talk nowadays, and a lot of it comes from me and my show, frankly, and guests that I've had on the show, saying college is a ripoff. Okay. I mean, it's just totally overpriced. Now, yes, the rich can afford it, but a lot of these college degrees, regardless of whether or not it's a good deal, and I don't think it is a very good deal, they're liberal arts degrees that don't really produce high incomes. Granted, they produce a network of high level people meeting high level people, right? But they don't really produce income in the real world unless they're STEM oriented or, law or, I don't know, your thoughts. You know where I'm going with that.
Yeah, I know where you're going. I think one really has to differentiate about colleges. Some colleges are literally a ripoff. So for-profit colleges are literally a ripoff in that they're extracting tuition from students in order to maximize their bottom line and not giving value for money. The average college degree in the United States remains actually an economically good investment. And the best estimates of the economic return to investment of attending an elite college, so let's say an Ivy League college, gives suggestions that the economic return on investment is north of 10% a year. Some estimates put it as high as 15, and for certain law schools, 30% a year. So that the
I get it.
To elite education are incredibly high, even if the returns to for-profit education are not.
Fair enough. I would just like to see those studies adjust for a pre-selection bias, because I think a lot of those people that are going to those elite schools would have been rich and successful anyway, even without college. They would have started a company, because that's just the way they think. They just view themselves as, they've got opportunity, they've got connections, they've got someone that's going to fund their business, or whatever it is, right?
It's really hard to know how to think about that. I think that's a deep question for the following reason. Our labor market has become so incredibly precisely sorted by elite education at the top that you can't separate the two effects from each other. So one of the things I did for the book is I actually counted in law where the partners at the 5 most profitable law firms went to law school. And at the most profitable law firm, something like 90% of the partners went to just 5 law schools.
Yeah.
Now, that firm doesn't recruit from other law schools effectively.
So you never know. Right?
You never know. If you didn't go to Harvard Law School, you're not getting a job at that firm, no matter how talented you are. So it's impossible to do the counterfactual. The big investment banks, traditionally, they recruit at Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Williams, and MIT. That's about it. So it may be that the kids who go to those universities would get great educations if they went elsewhere. But they'd have a very hard time getting a job at Goldman Sachs. And that means that your sort of counterfactual is really hard to play out. And that's part of the problem with our system. Our system is so skewed to sort of a convergent, a joint elitism in school and at work that it really cuts everybody else out from meaningful prospects of advantage and success.
Makes sense. Okay, go on with these slides are pretty darn interesting. What do you want to highlight next?
Well, so here's one, just a thought experiment. Remember, we're talking about meritocracy as a new kind of aristocracy. And the way in which the old elite, the old aristocrats, passed their privilege on to their children was basically just by dying. So that the older generation would die, and the younger generation would inherit the family estate or inherit the family business or factory. So let's do a thought experiment, and let's take the difference between what a typical 1% household invests in its children's education and a typical middle-class household invests. So not a poor household, but a middle-class household. And let's take that difference, the enrichment expenditures, the private school tuition, all that stuff, and let's not invest it in education, but instead put it in the S&P 500 each year to create a trust fund that's going to be given to the child as an inheritance on the death of the parents. So that's mimicking the old aristocratic way of creating dynasties. That amount would exceed $10 million per child. So what's basically happening is that this meritocratic, education-based, school investment-based system of privileging the rich is remaking the old aristocracy. It's just, instead of giving people the aristocratic inheritance, which was the family estate, they're getting the meritocratic inheritance, which is this incredibly, incredibly expensive and elite education. And it pays off. What this slide here shows you is the percentage of people at each education level who make the median lifetime earnings of people at a higher education level. So only about 1 in 75 Americans without a high school degree will have lifetime earnings equal to the median professional school graduate. And only about 1 in 40 Americans with a high school degree only will have lifetime earnings equal to the median professional school graduate. So that means is that 2/3 of Americans have a high school degree only. Among those 2/3, only about 1 in 40 will hit the ordinary income of a law school graduate. And that's how incredibly segmented our earnings have become by education. And that's why elites invest so much in educating their kids, because they want their kids to be on the top side of these enormous workplace divides.
And they are enormous, aren't they?
They are enormous.
Yeah. So what I didn't catch from the book is I didn't catch an idea of government policy, or this is a problem, right? It's a problem that few people recognize, really. It's I think it goes back to this kind of American ideal of rugged individualism and merit and all of that, which that gets you to a certain level in life, and it's not all bad. I think you would agree. But it also creates some unintended consequences. Where do we go from here?
What should we do about it?
What should be done? What could be done? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I have thoughts about that in two different ways. One is about politics, not policy, which is, where do we build a political movement, a coalition that can fight against this? Because history tells us that when the rich get really rich, they're incredibly good at clinging to their privilege. And it's very hard to dislodge them. And so what do we do about that? And part of the structure of the Meritocracy Trap book, which is something you picked up on early in our conversation, is to try to explain, including to the elite, that this system isn't good for them. That although they're incredibly rich, all of this schooling that they have to subject their children to, and all of the work that they themselves have to do when they're partners at law firms or managing directors at investment banks, involves trading off their freedom for money, but they're so rich that money has no value to them.
Right. You talked a lot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you made some very good points there. At what point? I mean, that's more of a psychological issue, really, about deciding how much is enough, isn't it?
Right. I think it is. But if you can persuade the elite that they have more than enough money and not enough freedom,
Hmm.
then they might join this coalition, and that's important. And so that's the
Mm.
political point. The policy point, what do we do about it? Well, I think there are two kinds of things we should do. One is in the labor market. Right now, our labor market policy, and in particular our wage tax policy, makes middle class labor the most heavily taxed factor of production in the economy. And that's because the Social Security tax wage base is cut off at about $137,000 a year. So that the first $137,000 of wages pay the Social Security wage tax, 13% roughly. And then the next wages pay none at all. And what that means is that the total tax burden on somebody making $100,000 a year on their labor income is higher than the total tax burden on the labor income of people making a lot more money than that. And that's a massive tax disincentive to create middle-class jobs. So we put a thumb on the scale against creating middle-class jobs in our economy. And we should change that. We should change the structure of wage taxation to favor middle-class workers and disfavor super elite workers. Basically, the system now gives people an incentive to get rid of $20,000, $100,000 a year jobs and replace that with $1-2 million a year job and a bunch of robots and computers. And that's what's been happening. So that's one thought.
Oh, at the company level, because you're saying because the businesses have to pay in so much that yes, it is better to have a very high end employee and a lot of robots and a lot of automation. Spend your money there versus that makes sense. Yeah, that pushes all the impetuses to the top. Yeah.
Right. And so there are things we could do in our tax policy and our labor market policy. I'm a big fan of wage subsidies. Middle-class wage subsidies can be very intelligently designed to encourage employment in good jobs. So that's one set of policies that we could deploy to rebuild the middle-class labor force. The other set of policies concern education. What we right now have is a massive, massive public subsidy for elite private education. Elite private schools and universities are treated as not-for-profits. Their endowments grow tax-free. Alumni donations are tax-deductible to the alumni. Somebody recently calculated that Princeton's tax-exempt status amounts to a public subsidy of about $100,000 per Princeton student per year.
And let's not talk about the size of the Harvard endowment. And I mean, it's kind of heresy for you to say this, given that you're a Yale professor, right?
Well, I mean, it's not a statement in my own interest.
Yeah, right. And I appreciate that, by the way. Yeah.
But at the same time, one of the things your job is, if you're a professor, is to call it as you see it. And it should be said, these institutions are so secure that nobody cares when I say this, because nobody thinks it's going to have any impact on anything.
And that's probably true. Yeah. It's just, it is ridiculous that, you go look at any significant college town anywhere around the country, and the university is the biggest landowner. Yeah. It's like they're running a giant hedge fund. Yeah. I mean, they're running a giant hedge fund and a branding, marketing, intellectual property licensing business. And the education's like this tiny little part, but it's all under the guise of education. So they get these fantastic tax benefits.
Absolutely. And so here's a back of the envelope calculation that I did. If you take the 10 largest American university endowments and look at their growth over the last 30 years and just project that rate of growth forward, and then imagine you take US household wealth and look at its growth over the past 30 years and project that forward, sometime around 2150, the 10 largest endowments in America will own all of America. Now that's obviously not going to happen. And the reason I do this thought experiment is that right now the universities love their tax exempt status and their wealth, but it also places huge burdens on them. They become targets of anger.
All right.
Their admissions departments become, in effect, social planners, deciding who gets ahead in America.
Right.
They become captured by powerful capital, banking, and corporate interests.
Right.
And they lose the ability to do the thing that led the universities, the professors, the people who become university administrators, who are all professors, to want to get into this business to begin with, which is teaching and scholarship. It all gets distorted by their incredible wealth. And if they were also willing to give up some of their wealth, then they could go back to doing what it is they went into life intending to do, which is to be scholars and educators. And
but that's never going to happen because there's too many immediate interests and self-interest that it's just never likely to happen. You know, you get these iron triangles in all areas of life, and that's what just ends up ruining everything.
I'm a little more optimistic than you. You know, when I just look around, obviously I know a lot of professors, and I know a lot of professors who become deans and presidents and administrators. And when they really think about what they care about, they're not happy with the system that they're now running. They would like to be able to teach students and to write their books and articles and to be freed of all of the trappings of this enormous wealth. Now, they're not saints, and they like living well, and they like having budgets, and they like living in nice houses. But it's not the case that they just want to maximize their economic position. They really don't. And so I think if they can be shown a path out that will allow them to keep, they can keep a lot of wealth. They can keep more wealth than they deserve. But at the same time, go back to the ideals of scholarship and teaching that brought them into their careers. I think a surprising number of them would be willing to take it if it could be shown to them.
Do you have any more slides to show us? And of course, we could talk about the student loan thing, but we've done that ad nauseum on the show, and the government insurance of it and so forth. I'm sure you've discussed that a lot. Do you have more slides you want us to see, though?
I think I'm good on the slides. I mean, I could show you more, but we've hit the main points of what I think this conversation really should be focusing on.
Just wrap it up for us with any, any closing ideas. You kind of maybe did that already, but anything else, action people can take or concerns people should have about it, because I think we see this divide happening, and in some ways, the country is turning into a banana republic. And, I don't think that's a very pleasant place to live. I mean, a big middle class makes society stable. It makes countries stable. And it's a good thing.
Yeah. So let me talk about the divide and say something about sort of each side of the divide. If you're in the middle class or in the working class, and you see that your kids in particular don't have the opportunities that you did, or that your parents did, you're right. First of all, that's happening in our society. But it's really important to understand that the reason for this is not immigration. It's not people of color. The reason for this is that the elite is hogging all of the advantage for itself and dominating the avenues that you need to go down in order to get ahead. And so it's structural exclusion by an economic elite. And that's the place that middle class anger should be directed. So that's the first point, I think. The second point is that if you're in the elite, if you think that you can both be rich and free, you're mistaken. That if you're rich because you inherited a factory, then maybe you can be free too, because maybe you can take your factory and mix it with other people's labor and take some income out and lead the life you want. But if you're rich the way in which most rich people in America are rich today, which is that you got an incredibly fancy education, you worked your way all through high school and college, You got a job at an investment bank. You worked 100 hours a week. You're now a managing director. You're still working 80 hours a week. You cannot keep all of your income and get your life back and your time back, because the way in which you extract income is by using yourself up, using your training to extract income from your own labor. And that means you have to choose between being rich and being free, and that the best choice for you is to accept being a little bit less rich and being a lot freer. And those two movements, a middle class movement against economic privilege and an elite movement to recapture its own freedom from the burdens of its privilege, can together form a politics that can get us out of the very dangerous place that you've just described that we're in.
Give out your website or Twitter account or whatever you'd like people to know.
Best way to see me on Twitter is at DS Markovits on Twitter.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for doing this.